Hello everyone. Welcome to another stunning session of NextGen 22. Aviation is ever evolving. UTM or unmanned traffic management is a term used frequently but often misunderstood within the industry. Our guest speaker today is going to share his stance on UTM and why it's essential for the next evolution in air traffic management, while opening the skies safely to all users. To share the new methodology that helps enable safe flight for both crewed and uncrewed aircraft, please welcome Philip Biggs. Philip joined Altitude Angel in the May of 2018 to take up the newly created position of Head of Air Traffic Management. Previously, Philip worked for the UK's largest ANSP, NATS, where he led the position for RPAS domain experts and solution architect. In this role, he was the focal point for all RPAS activities. In addition, Philip supported several high-profile programs such as the UK's Pathfinder program, the Industry Action program, and held a seat on the ICAO RPAS panel. Having begun his career in the aviation as an air traffic controller for the RAF, Philip has unrivaled knowledge of ATM and airspace and understands the complexity of integrating drones safely into our airspace. Over to you, Philip.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to come along and speak today. It's much appreciated. Look, let me just start by sharing my screen so I can go through a presentation with you. So just one moment, please. Hi, hopefully you can now see my screen. As it says, why is UTM important for uncrewed operations, or other people call it unmanned operations or remotely piloted operations? There are lots and lots of names given to this new airspace user. But fundamentally, I would like to explain and talk to why we actually need a UTM to support this activity, and also to help with that integration piece and the communication piece with traditional ATM activities, air traffic management. So what I've decided to do is talk through a route. It's not a formal recognised route, but it's a route across London. Most people have heard of London. It's a city that I know very well. And the issues facing London today with introduction of UAM, AAM, advanced air mobility or urban air mobility or drones will probably have resonance or similarities across other cities around the world. And although I've mentioned primarily large drones, this isn't just affecting large drones. This could be smaller drones and operating visual line of sight activities or beyond visual line of sight activities. But they all have some fundamentally the same issues which need to be addressed. And this is why we'll need UTM. So let's take a flight then. What we're going to be talking about is very simply a flight from London City Airport to Heathrow Airport. Hopefully you recognise those airports. Well, they're from one side of London to the other side of London. And in between, we have quite a complex bit of airspace. Now, if a manned aircraft was to fly from London City to London Heathrow, what they'd have to do is submit a flight plan. So air traffic management or NATS could find out about the flight. And the way the organisations get to hear about the flight is you submit a flight plan. So you put the airport of departure, London City, the route of which you wish to take, and then the destination, London Heathrow. And you submit this flight plan on what we call an ICAO 4444 flight plan, and it gets disseminated to the relevant agencies. You've got to put an addressee list, a number of addresses down. So the first address would be London City, so air traffic control at London City would know about the aircraft. Then you'd have to go off to NATS, as NATS, the air navigation service providers for this airspace. They would wish to know about that flight. And then the destination airport, Heathrow, obviously they would like to know about the flight also. So you have what we call an ICAO address list. And for example, London City will be Lima Golf, Lima Charlie. Heathrow is Lima Golf, Lima Lima, Echo Golf, Lima Lima. And if it was to go to Swanwick Centre, where the aircraft would be controlled from, Swanwick Centre is Echo Golf, Tango X-ray. And very similar things happen all around the world. So, for example, Mumbai Air Traffic Control Centre, you need a Victor Alpha Bravo Foxtrot, and that will make sure that this flight plan goes to Mumbai Air Traffic Control Centre. But does the same thing work for unmanned aviation? So this is what we'll start to explore. And this is where I think we'll start to understand that perhaps the traditional methods don't work in the same way for unmanned aircraft. So let's start talking about the airspace structure that we'll go through. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with airspace structure, so let me just quickly explain the basics. Where airspace can be divided into two elements, basically. You have controlled airspace. That's when there's an airspace manager, somebody who manages the airspace, somebody who says yes or no to an aircraft, they can fly through that airspace. Element of management. In order to access that airspace, you have to have a minimum equipage levels on board the aircraft. And quite typically, believe it or not, is a radio, a VHF radio, so you can actually speak to air traffic control. But on the flip side of that, there's other pieces of airspace which are uncontrolled airspace. A good example of this is Class G airspace. And Class G airspace is what we call open VFR. Anybody can fly there. You don't even need a radio on board the aircraft to speak to anybody, so you can just go flying. And there are two elements of airspace. As I say, I could get into more detail, but I don't think it's needed for this presentation. But here is what we have, a CTR and a CTA. We have control zones and control areas. Control zones are pieces of airspace that go from surface, from the ground, up to a particular height, and then from control areas go from a particular height up to another specified height. But these are managed pieces of airspace, so you must inform people in order to transit through that airspace. So in this case, it would be NATS, so that's quite simple. But as we know, London and a lot of airspace around cities is incredibly busy today. There's a lot of traffic going into Heathrow. There's a lot of traffic going to London City. And there's a lot of adjacent airports as well, just outside of this picture, like Gatwick, there's Luton, Stansted. So we start to get quite a complex environment. And now we think of introducing unmanned aircraft into this as well. So now we start to go, how are we going to manage all these additional flights to access this airspace? Now, today, ATM is all around people. It's all around the communication of voice communication from the air traffic controller through to the pilot to pass an instruction, and the pilot carries out the instruction. Well, you're not going to be able to do that with unmanned aviation. So therefore, how can ATM control this unmanned aircraft? And in order to control more aircraft, you actually need more people. And so quite simply, ATM isn't scalable. There's a cost associated to it. So we need to think of other ways of dealing with it. So as we move on, we'll start to introduce more complex, we'll start to see how complex the airspace can be. Now, what we have here then is, we have just seen the CTAs and the CTRs, that's controlled by NATS. We don't actually know what level the drones are going to be operating at, or the UAM, urban air mobility, advanced air mobility, will be operating at. So we need to consider, we think, well, is it going to affect other airports? Now, we have some minor airports like Denham, Northolt, well, that's a military airport very, very close to the centre of London. But then also we have Battersea Heliport, that's right in the middle of London. So they would like to know if they have drones transiting the airspace. It's very, very important, obviously, for safety. And finally, there's London City, as you see, but that's where we're starting off. But we're starting to build up this picture now, depending on the heights or the altitudes of which these drones are going to be operating at. We start to think, who else needs to be informed about this flight? So from there, it's not just other airports. We have things like Heli Routes. Now, these Heli Routes are what we call VFR operations, visual flight rule operations. So if you wish to follow Heli Routes, you must be able to look out of the window of your aircraft and see for yourself what's around you and make sure you miss everything else in the sky. Well, there's some fundamental problem there when we start introducing unmanned aircraft. By its very nature, it's unmanned, therefore there's nobody on there to look out of the window to make sure it's not being a hazard to other airspace users and make sure it can avoid anything else that's in the sky. So we've got a big, big problem. We can't operate VFR in Heli Routes. So we need to think about how we're going to get past those. So effectively what we have is unmanned aircraft or uncrewed aircraft are operating IFR, instrument rules only. So how do we look out of the window to see what else is going on? We have other activities as well, like gas venting sites. Anything that's introducing element of turbulence in the sky, these airframes are going to be relatively small compared to commercial aircraft we see today. So are gas venting sites going to be a problem? Are they going to generate a hazard? They could very well be. And also then, we have these other things, minor airports. There's a site called Brooklands. Brooklands is a site of one of the first Grand Prix circuits ever, purpose-built Grand Prix circuits. It's now a museum, but it has fly-in times, aircraft fly in from time to time. Well, if we were to go down the ICAO address list, these guys don't have an ICAO reference. So now we're starting to think, how can we inform elements or an airport about a drone flight that may be transiting its area, but we can't use the ICAO address list. We can't use the purpose of manned aviation here. So how do we get around that? So could we start to use telephone lines, telephone calls? Well, I suppose we could. But if we start to go down that route, well, we start to get increasing workload quite considerably. So we're asking an ATCO not only just to control all the manned aircraft, but to think about the unmanned aircraft, and then to think about those elements that actually aren't on. We can't think about the airports that don't have an ICAO address list, and then we've got to get someone else to phone up those. So we start to get ever more complicated. But that isn't the end of it. Around a lot of cities, we have other restrictive areas. But in London here, we have things like the Isle of Dogs. And I'll put up the other one is the City of London. These are what we call Romeo areas, and this is Romeo 158 and 159. Now, these are financial centres or right in the city centre. You can't simply just fly an aircraft through these areas. You've got to get other approvals. And in fact, the Isle of Dogs and the City of London have banned drone operations, have banned unmanned aircraft operations, because they don't wish they are potentially a security risk. And then we've got this Hyde Park area as well. Now, Hyde Park is where a lot of the VIPs live, with embassies, royal families, government offices and stuff like that. And therefore, we have this other element where we've got to get the security services involved. And the security services will want to know exactly who's flying through that airspace at what time. And they will have the ultimate say of whether it can or cannot go ahead. So we're looking right in the centre of London here. If you look at right in the middle of that map, we have NATs who generally manage the airspace, but in there we have Battersea Heliport, and they will want to know about any drone operations taking place because of the helicopters in and out. And then we have Hyde Park, Romeo area, Romeo 157. Now that's security services going in there. So all of a sudden, just for that one tiny little bit of space, you have three elements or three authorities that will want to say yes or no to a flight actually taking place in that area. So as you can see, just a little area like that, it now starts to get very, very complicated. And as I said before, if the security service needs to give approval, what's their ICAO address? They don't have a ICAO address. And can we get the information back from them fast enough? So we need to think about how can we engage non-traditional aviation authorities into an approval process, an aviation approval process. So we're starting to build up more stakeholders. So we go on to other elements as well. What we're finding is we've had a lot of conversations in and around cities and other areas of regions of countries and other regions of the world. And as people start to understand what drones are happening, they start to look at, well, actually, we want to know about this. And what we have in London is the London Port Authority. Well, their jurisdiction is the River Thames. They manage the traffic along the River Thames. So you're thinking, well, what have they got to do with drones? Well, lo and behold, they say in order to protect what's going on the Thames, they need to know what's flying above the Thames. And therefore, if it's flying above the Thames, they want to get approval of whether the operation should take place or not. Now, as it stands, this is where there's some regulatory concerns. Who actually has the authority to manage that airspace? Now, of course, London Port Authority has, I completely understand, they want to make sure all the rivers, or whoever uses the river, they are protected and they're not going to get anything falling out of the sky hitting them. But should they actually manage the airspace? Should they have an element of managing the airspace themselves, which is something they'd like to do? There is a system. What we have is a aircraft operating over a city is a fly clear. So you don't get single engine operations going over a large city or a built up area, an urban environment, unless they can demonstrate they can glide clear. So if the engine fails, they can clear all the urban area and crash in a safe area, i.e. a field somewhere like that. So I'm not sure how that plays with drones or unmanned, urban air mobility or AAM, but there's something that needs to be taken in consideration. So anyway, London Port Authority is now taking a very, very keen interest. There's also Transport for London. Now, Transport for London, they coordinate all the transport activities, the public transport across the whole city. So again, in London, like many cities, you probably have buses, you have trains, you're managing the road networks. But now they're thinking, well, if we're having air taxis, do we need to get involved in the air taxis as well to make sure it's integrated, having a complete network, and the network actually working for the people of London, and that people not just live there, but people actually work in London as well. So there's another element that they want to be able to manage. So again, it's a fine line. Do they need to manage the airspace? Or do they need to manage the approvals? Or do they just need to make sure that it's all integrated in a complete transport network for the city to make sure it all works for the city and the people of that city? And finally then, local councils. Now, as I said earlier on, we don't know what level these drones are going to be operating at, or UAM are going to be operating at. If they operate at a high level, a highish level, 2,000 to 3,000 feet, well, they're now mixing straight in with manned aviation. So that's going to add an element of complexity for air traffic control. And I've already articulated at that kind of level, and they're mixing with air traffic control. How does air traffic control speak to an unmanned or uncrewed aircraft? So there's a complexity there. So therefore, is that an appropriate level? So then we start to come down a level. And let's say let's operate below that level now. Let's say we're operating down at 500 feet. Well, we do have the complexity then, as I've already mentioned, of the heli lanes and how we deconflict against those heli lanes. So that, let's say we can do that. But if we start to have drones flying around, there's an element of noise pollution coming in, or there's an element of visual pollution coming in. Now, some of the drones is going to be obvious. They're air taxis. They're going to go from A to B, and we can see them. They're a taxi service, no problems at all. There are other activities that could be taking place where, beyond visual line of sight activities, where there may be surveying taking place. There may be security services activities taking place. But the key to all of these is going to have an effect on the general public, the citizens of that city. They're going to see all of this, or they're going to hear all of this, and they're going to get potentially quite frustrated by all the noise. If you just have one fixed route going from London City across to Heathrow, well, how many hundreds of these drone operations are going to take place a day? And noise is a very, very is a big issue that needs to be addressed in aviation. Heathrow have worked very, very hard to address noise pollution by alternating runways on different approaches and stuff like this at different times of the day. But because of these drones now operating even lower levels of the manned aircraft, are the local councils going to have to get involved in the routes of where these drones can and cannot take place? So local councils will probably want to be informed, or have some say about the routes or the complexities of where these drone operations are going to transit. And again, they may have to be shared. The noise may have to be spread out across the city. So there may have to be several routes that go from, let's say, London City or from the City of London through to Heathrow. But the noise is going to have to be shared. So at certain times of the day, only certain routes are going to be allowed. And again, it's something that needs to be addressed, but it's something that, unless we get local council support and you get public acceptance of these activities taking place, we just simply won't be able to take the advantages that drones can bring. And there are many, many benefits that drones can bring to societal benefits. Okay, so we've gone from London City, we're almost now, we're getting right across the place, almost at Heathrow. Let's look at Heathrow and see what happens next. Oops, right. Here we go, Heathrow, single airport. But it's not just a single customer. So Heathrow, who is actually the most important authority at the airport? Arguably, it's security. Security will have a big say about where these drones are coming from. They all want to know about the routes in and out of this airspace. There's an awful lot going on. So security are one lot of people that will need to know. Air traffic control, yeah, absolutely. They'll definitely want to know. They'll need to deconflict it against the manned aircraft. Now, they might not necessarily control the UAM, urban air mobility, going into the airport, but they'll need to know about it. Now, again, as I said earlier on, what we'll probably find happening is air traffic control are incredibly busy. It's a very busy and complex environment, Heathrow is, and they don't want to get distracted by the urban air mobility. So we need to find a system whereby that the UAMs can carry on and as expected, but they don't have to have a positive control from air traffic control. So air traffic control can do their prime role of ensuring that manned aircraft are safe. But what we do need to know is, as long as the UAM are adhering to their expected routes, everything's fine. But as soon as they're no longer conforming as expected, then we need to send some form of alert to air traffic control. So some procedure could be put in place to say, this isn't as expected, there's a safety risk here, therefore air traffic control can do something. So it's now you're introducing controlling by exception. So there's an element of that now comes into play. And then, of course, we have the police. The police will always want to be informed, have a big picture of what is going on. And then at Heathrow, we have airside operations, the APOC. And then who else at the airport will we need to know? So just simply there, just at the airport there are at least 4 elements we'll need to know. But the key to this, to ensuring it works correctly, is there's a single point of truth. Everybody understands what is going on with the unmanned aircraft. So if there is a mix-up, if there's an element of coordination that's required or something's not happening quite right, that can be identified very quickly across all parties. And this is what UTM is trying to do. So as I've said, I've just tried to show a very simple route going from one side of a city to another side of a city. It's about 25 miles. But in there, you've got potentially 16 to 20 other agencies that will need to be informed. Now, none of these agencies have ever had anything to do with aviation before. Well, a lot of the agencies have nothing to do with aviation before, and therefore, if you start introducing ICAO flight plans, they won't understand. There aren't any ICAO flight plan addresses for a council, for a security service. So now we need to disseminate the information in a different way. And that's what UTM does. We've got to disseminate the information in a way that a person, a non-aviator, can understand. We've got to give the information that everybody gets the same piece of information. They can see exactly what's going on. They get the single point of truth. And the UTM will ensure that the appropriate authorities are asked about that flight. So the drone operator or the UAM operator isn't expected to know about every single agency that will need to know about that flight. The UTM will look at the route, assess the route, disseminate the information accordingly to the appropriate authorities, and get those approvals. Once they've got all the approvals, the flight can take place. But it's not until they get all the approvals will they allow that flight to get airborne. It won't say, yes, you have the approval to get airborne. And of course, not all things are equal. Just because a council will accept that flight through the airspace doesn't mean to say the security services will, or the police or ATC. So there's lots and lots of elements there. But as I say, it can get incredibly complicated. But this is all about keeping it simple for the operator and ensuring that the UTM disseminates the right information to the right people at the right time in order to maintain a safe environment and not to overload the current airspace managers, i.e. air traffic control, the ATM. They do an incredibly important job at the moment, we can't afford to distract them with these new airspace users unless there's a big safety risk, and then they can address it. So I think that's my final slide. It is. There's a Q&A session here, but hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an insight into the potential complexities of just introducing urban air mobility or drones into an environment that may appear quite simple, but as you dig down, more and more agencies wish to get involved. So I'll stop sharing, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip.
Questions?
Thanks for helping us understand why UTM is the key for remote operations. With this, we would now like to open a house for a round of Q&A. So audience, please use the Q&A tab to ask the questions. All right, we have a few questions. All right, so first question is, how fast can people get an update on the dynamic airspace? For example, the no-fly zones on a particular day.
That's a really interesting question. So, and it's so important. It's so important. So what we do here at Altitude Angel, what we have is a Guardian UTM operating system. And we have, for the UK alone, we have 57 different data feeds coming into the system to ensure that we give real quality data out to the airspace user. And one of those is live data. One of those is, you may have heard of NOTAM, so notice to airmen. Now that notice to airmen can inform airspace users of many bits and pieces. It could be frequencies, it could be navigation beacons, but of course it's closures of airspace, which is fundamental, and a temporary closure of airspace, which is very important. And utilizing a tool like Altitude Angel's UTM solution, or we have a thing called Drone Safety Map. It's accessible in, I think it's 83 countries around the world. Real-time feed information, it tells you about it. And on top of that, as you submit a flight plan, we can spend what we call airspace alerts. So if anything changes once a drone is airborne, we can send alert to the drone operator, and the drone operator can then just go, right, there's been a change to the airspace, and therefore today it would mean the drone operator can do something about that. Tomorrow, the UTM will automatically probably replan that drone operation, and it can manage the case itself. But today it's making sure it can inform the human in the loop to ensure the airspace remains safe at all times.
All right, thank you. I hope that answers your question. The next is, how would you say regulations have helped in management of drone flights and getting the info you need to monitor air traffic?
Oh, sorry, I'd misheard some of that. Can you just say that again?
Okay. How would you say regulations have helped in the management of drone flights and getting the info you need to monitor air traffic?
So really, oh wow, that's a really interesting question. So all around the world, different regions of the world, the regulation is developing at different speeds. Today, we don't necessarily have beyond visual line of sight operations, routine beyond visual line of sight operations. They primarily take place in what we call segregated airspace. So airspace is closed off, and therefore beyond visual line of sight operation can take place, and nothing else can add into that airspace. And that's where regulation is today. Regulations are still being developed. And the key is what we want to try and do is to get more and more drone activities taking place in order to provide evidence to the regulators so they can develop the right regulation in order to enable the operations to take place. Now, I know I haven't really answered the question. It's still really evolving. As I say, it's very early in the industry. There's a huge steep learning curve, and the regulators, quite rightly, must ensure that the airspace remains safe for current airspace users, as well as ensuring that people on the ground aren't going to get hurt if there's an incident. So it is a slow, intuitive process. The thing we can do, though, is support the regulators by giving them evidence, trialing things, get things flying, give the regulators evidence, and make sure the appropriate regulations are in place. It is happening. It's happening at different speeds in different regions of the world. we've just got to keep supporting the regulators to make sure this happens. Something that we do an awful lot of here at Altitude Angel.
So the next question is from Brandon. You mentioned ATC does deconfliction with manned aircraft. Does AA handle deconfliction between unmanned aircraft? At a high level, how does it do this?
Are you talking about, is that talking about high-level pseudo-satellites? So we're talking very, very high, sort of 66,000 feet, that height. Is that what that question's referring to, do you know?
Brandon?
It hasn't said, have they? I don't know whether somebody can just, whoever's typed that question, if they could just clarify, are you talking about altitudes really, really high at 66,000 feet or flight level 660?
High level in terms of conceptually.
Conceptual. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not 100% clear on the question. I really apologise. So what I think it is, very, very high altitude stuff. We have today, and I apologise if I'm being really, really basic and simple, the majority of drone operations affecting us today are very, very low level, sub 500 feet. Manned aircraft then operates in levels up to about 45,000, 50,000 feet with commercial airlines, they're flying at that level. You do have a few military aircraft that operate above that. And then we get to sort of 66,000, get to 60 to 66,000 feet, and we go into high level airspace. It's what we call non-controlled airspace. Some people call it Class E airspace or Class G airspace. And this is where we're seeing these pseudo-satellite aircraft operating. High altitude pseudo-satellite aircraft. Now, I don't see those aircraft, they could be up there for months at a time. I don't see manned ATC controlling those aircraft. They're automated machines. So there will be an element of UTM managing the airspace up there to deconflict it. And it will be an automated system with a person over the loop rather than a person actually getting actively involved in controlling. Obviously, there's a problem with that. If there's an issue with an aircraft really, really high level, and it's got to come back down. It's got to come back down through all this manned aviation in order to come back down safely and land safely. So how does that? There's an element of coordination then that's needed to get through all of that, and of course that's got to be looked at. It's got to be explored. We don't really want to close off vast volumes of airspace, big tubes of airspace, to let these aircraft spiral down in a controlled manner, because they could block critical, very, very busy periods of time. So I'm hoping that's answered the question. Again, if you haven't, I'm happy to take an email, ping an email to me, and I'll try and write it down and explain it a little bit better. So I apologise, but that's kind of, I think, where we're going with that question.
I guess Brandon has rephrased the question. Does Altitude Angel do deconfliction between US operations?
So two elements of that. There's strategic deconfliction. So strategic and tactical deconfliction. Strategic deconfliction is to plan and avoid. And it happens in manned aviation. You flight plan a system, and what you get flow control in manned aviation. That's an element of planning and avoid. And that's absolutely what we do. And basically what we do is unmanned aviation. There's a volume of airspace here, which one aircraft or unmanned aircraft is operating in. There's another volume of airspace or another UAM is operating in. We make sure the two don't overlap. And if they do, we address the problem. Again, that is sort of segregating aircraft rather than integrating them. They're having big blocks of airspace, which are sort of closed off to other airspace users. Not very, very efficient. So the next level you go to is what we call tactical deconfliction. And that's what it means is, tactically, you've done strategic deconfliction to make sure hopefully things remain clear. But as you start to get tactical, there's a real-time information coming in. You can see there's a definite risk of confliction, and therefore the UTM will provide the necessary instructions in order to deconflict those aircraft. Today, there's a human in the loop. Tomorrow, there'll be a human over the loop. Humans will not be involved. As the airspace gets busy and you start to get thousands of these drone operations taking place, there's no way a human will be able to process everything that's going on, and therefore the UTM will take over and provide that tactical deconfliction capability.
All right. There are a lot of questions falling, but I guess we can answer like one last question. So this question is from Jonathan. Do you think there will be a dedicated corridors for drones to operate in?
I don't want there to be, is the answer to that. Today, I think it's going to be an evolutionary process. Today, in order to get drones operating, corridors are a sensible way to go forward, because they're corridors. It's enabling a segregated airspace. It's enabling sure the airspace is sterilized for a drone to travel beyond visual line of sight. It can go through there. Nothing else is going to use that piece of airspace. The only trouble with a corridor is you're segregating and you're not integrating drones. And segregation is not necessarily scalable. If you're closing off all of these lumps of airspace and no other airspace user can use that airspace, it's just not a scalable approach. And other airspace users, traditional airspace users, are going to get enormously frustrated by this. So there is a technology, and again, Altitude Angel are leaders in this and focusing on it, where we are setting up corridors for drones to operate in, but there'll be non-segregated airspace. So anything can transit through that airspace, whatever they want, but they'll be following effectively a corridor in the sky. So the drone will have to follow a corridor, but nobody else has to adhere to that corridor at all. So we want to make sure that we are integrating and not segregating. Yes, there may be corridors, but those corridors are going to be not restricting other airspace users. But quite simply, also, the technology that's going to be used around those corridors can be used over areas as well. So it can be used in an area of an entire city to enable unmanned and manned aircraft to operate side by side and it be integrated safely into the airspace.
Thank you, Philip. But before we go, would you like to share any closing thoughts?
Wow. Look, there's so many interesting. This topic is a massive topic. I think it's absolutely brilliant that there are more and more regions of the world that are starting to explore the benefits that drones can bring. I think it's a really, really exciting industry. I love to see more and more of these kind of conferences taking place. I like to get involved in these conferences and get these discussions going. I think it's really, really important that we have these discussions. We support the drone operations moving forward, because that's the only way we're going to enable safe drone operations to take place. And when we start ensuring safe drone operations, we will then see the real benefits that drones can bring, the real societal benefits. And that's whether it's in a disaster area, or that could be on a day-to-day basis in a town or a city. But that's what I think we're aiming for. And I think it's got a really exciting industry to get involved with, because it really is at its infancy. So thank you very much for inviting me to come along to speak today. It is much appreciated. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Altitude Angel, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We have 3 exciting sessions coming up in the next 5 minutes. Please visit the reception or the sessions tab to learn more about the upcoming sessions. Have a great day at Nesgen. Thank you.